Hey there, welcome, or maybe I should say welcome back to this next module in our AZ-2007, which is all about accelerating application development using GitHub Copilot. This specific module covers developing unit testing, one of the more complex tasks, I would say, for developers. My name is Peter Detender. I'm a Microsoft technical trainer, and I'm going to try and help you as good as I can, understanding not only what are unit tests, but also obviously where you can rely on GitHub Copilot to help you understanding what are unit tests, how to write them, and then eventually talking about not only how to create that one single unit test, but also moving into creating a full unit test project. So only a few touching points here in this module, but nevertheless, as always, if you've been watching some of the other modules in this course, it's always starting with setting the scene, walking you through a few slides, every now and then mixing some whiteboarding, and then closing the module with a demo sequence, allowing you also to not only watch the demos, but actually going through yourself using that sample application project we already referenced multiple times. So that I would say, welcome once more, and let's dive in the topic of unit testing. I can imagine you're eager to see how GitHub Copilot can help you creating, building, testing your unit test framework. But before that, let's start with another warm-up whiteboard question here. What is your experience around developing unit tests? For me, as a junior developer, I'm thinking about testing frameworks, which could be like XUnit, NUnit, or the Microsoft test framework. Another one I pick up here is that writing unit tests is complex. You're typically going to use some sample data, mockup data, right? Where you could provide feedback that at some point in time, if you have too many tests going on, you got too much mockup data, which means that it might skew the results of your testing a little bit. Another one I hear here is it's challenging for legacy code or legacy applications. Time intensive, pretty good. Well, maybe not that good, but it's a good answer here. And then the last one is sometimes limited in catching all possible errors. So I think these are the highlights of the complexity around unit testing. And obviously, a big part of what this module is about is how GitHub Copilot is going to help you making a lot of these tasks a lot easier for you. So with that, let's switch back to our presentation. Now, unit testing, and again, if you've been watching all modules in this course, you know that Peter is not a full-time developer. Why not? Because I'm a technical trainer. I understand code, I know how to write code, and honestly, I feel a lot more confident writing code thanks to using GitHub Copilot myself. Now, one of the struggling points for me when writing code, when developing an application, is not always being 100% sure that the way I see that application coming to life is like 100% fail-safe, 100% foolproof. That's where we really need to rely on unit testing. On the other side, unit testing to me is also one of the more complex parts of writing code, building your application. Why? Because it really depends on your coding environment. I like to switch every now and then between Visual Studio and VS Code, and there's no, I would say, logic in Peter's brain to decide when to use what. If it's a more complex project, a larger project, I tend to lean on Visual Studio, where if it's like a quick demo sample app I need to build for my Azure classes, that's where I typically use the VS Code. Now, the cool thing is that within GitHub Copilot, the experience, as you already could see in other modules in this course, the experience to behavior is exactly the same. Now, when you start building your unit tests, it's not only depending on the coding environment, where the behavior for building them, creating them is slightly different, but it also obviously depends on your language. In our examples, we're using .NET. The mindset, the concept of writing tests is basically the same across all languages. And I would say it's probably about the same complexity in whatever language you're writing. Then next to that, obviously, you also need to have that full testing framework support And I'll show you what we mean by that during the actual demo sequence. And then last, and again, that's where I would say start relying on GitHub Copilot to really help you building them in a more efficient way, being more productive in writing the tests. But if you already have experience in writing unit tests, then maybe a big part of the work is not really changing. But even then, maybe forget a bit about doing it all yourself and try to rely on embracing GitHub Copilot to just assist you, or maybe even validate the code that you're writing. So in short, there's a few dependencies. Again, our assumption is we're using our sample application for all the demos, for all the walkthrough labs, and it's using C#.NET code, which now means inside our Visual Studio Code environment, recommendation number 1 is install that C# development kit or the dev kit extension inside the VS Code environment, because that's really what you need to start creating unit testing. Once it's integrated, you're gonna rely on it literally as natural as possible, which means now you're gonna integrate the dev kit. Next to that, you're also gonna integrate your testing framework. You could think about some already existing frameworks like XUnit, I think is one of the popular ones, and Unit, MS Test frameworks, as you can see here on the slide, are just one of the other options. And again, the nice thing is that nothing is really changing. You already know how to write tests perfect. Start doing or continue doing what you were already doing. But if you're new to unit tests, like in Peter's case, it means that you're going to start small, you're going to rely on the tools, the best practices. Maybe you're going to start reading documentation, but then you need to speed up. Because again, our imaginary use case here for setting the scene on GitHub Copilot is that you're a new developer in a team, maybe building a new application. You might be an experienced developer working with the same team and still looking for ways to optimize your job, or what we mentioned at the start of the course, also optimizing having fun in the job. And again, to me personally, writing unit tests, I would say, is not always fun. So how does this work, integrating GitHub Copilot? As always, if you watched all the other modules, it's helping you documenting code, which now means documenting tests. It's allowing you to explain tests if you find some sample code somewhere else, or if you need to rely on unit tests from a colleague, maybe out of another application project you developed, where now it's going to help you explaining, documenting, but now also actually helping you writing the code. Now also remember, I keep repeating this, I know, but you're in control. You're the main pilot, you're not getting replaced. And that's where Copilot again becomes your pair programming friend. You're going to embrace it in the same way as your other developing or DevOps engineer team colleagues. You're just going to make it as natural as possible, which now means, referring to a few examples that I mentioned before, you're going to start writing your tests. So you're inside this GitHub Copilot workspace, and you're going to start writing a prompt, and you're going to ask like, hey, my dear GitHub Copilot, can you help me creating a test to do something? And I'll walk you through the demo how this actually works a little bit more towards the end of the module. Apart from that, it starts creating, and where again are the benefits? First of all, it's going to recognize the best practices from the already existing unit testing frameworks, which means that you could maybe skip parts of you reading through the documentation. You don't need to become that unit testing writing expert anymore, because that's in the end what GitHub Copilot is now going to help you with. Which means that it's going to allow you to identify the starting points of writing tests, and then a little bit later on also helping you with, again, those more complex edge cases, boundary conditions, as we describe it, within the complex field of unit testing. And then last, accelerating overall, developing the actual unit tests. So a lot of benefits, but in the end, it's just reusing one of the so many other already, I would say, recognized, explained traditional features of GitHub Copilot on one end, and obviously integrating the chat conversation capabilities on the other side. So in short, here on the slide, and then quickly jumping to a series of demos, you're going to start with creating a test project. Because now in this last example here, we're shifting away from creating like maybe one individual unit test, but really embracing this more complex, more complete writing unit testing project. So what we're going to do traditionally is using the good old Visual Studio Code approach, open the comment palette, create a new project. You're going to select your framework and it's adding all the tests into it. Or I was wrong, you need to integrate all the tests. We're now, thanks to GitHub Copilot, you're still going to do the same thing. We're not changing anything. We're not changing the concept of what it takes to write unit tests, but you're not writing them anymore yourself, which means it's recognizing the code syntax. It's going to bring in the test explorer, like really making it as approachable, as natural as possible to start interacting with your unit testing. It's going to allow you to run the debugging testing, providing an explanation if a test is failing. You could go back to the chat completion. Please explain why it fails. And most probably, you don't even have to ask the chat completion for that because it's going to give you that response anyway. And then viewing the test results, which obviously makes total sense. And actually, why not thinking about another scenario that I'm not 100% sure if we actually do have that in a demo, but you could start from an existing set of tests, going through the results, and then maybe asking to write even more tests for you. Like again, there's so many examples I could walk you through. It's all on PowerPoint, a couple of screenshots. So with that, I would say join me into my sequence of demos where we have two different scenarios for this one. I'm going to start with the basics of creating like a single unit test, again, based on our sample application, and then gradually moving into the more complex scenarios using the edge cases, using the more complex scenarios to really show you that it's not capable of integrating like an easy, simple, basic unit test, but actually allowing you to really touch on those edge cases as well and integrating a full end-to-end unit testing project. So with that, let's jump in our next sequence of demos. So for this next demo, or at least the first part of the demo, it's about creating a new project where we're going to inject some unit testing. Now, if you've been watching the previous modules, I mainly used our just file explorer, you could say, inside Visual Studio Code, where for this one, it's going to be a little bit blending the solution explorer view that you have to use for creating your unit testing anyway, but then also showing you, instead of you doing all the work to create the actual test and testing code, that it's actually going to help us out of GitHub Copilot using the chat conversation that we're already becoming more and more familiar with. So I opened, if you're following along, by the way, I opened another little sample application project folder. We're inside AZ-2007 M4 because that's the module we're in, and called Prime Service. I opened up my Solution Explorer and we do have our solution Prime Service, and within we got some numbers, we got our dependencies, and we got a little sample class already here, all pre-built for us. But again, we're gonna pretty much start a totally new project in just a couple of minutes. So out of our Solution Explorer, I would say that's quite important. We start with adding a new project, and just a traditional Visual Studio Code experience, it's going to ask us like, okay, what kind of project do you want me to add here? So for this example, I'm going to use the XUnit testing project type, and it's going to ask for a name. So we could do something like Prime Service, because that's the main name of the app. And I would say following some best practices naming convention using unit tests. And that's all it takes from here. It's going to ask us, where do you want me to create all the source files? I'm accepting the default suggestions and creating the project. There we go. If you don't really like to use the VS Code interface, or you go like, well, I could do this faster using .NET command line, or you want to learn how to do that, it would be .NET new XUnit, pointing to the framework template, right? And then again, providing the name using the -n as the parameter Prime Services unit tests. So we created our project, and it's again coming back with a few sample files. but for now, we're not really gonna use them. So we could actually get rid of this little file here. Now, one of the first steps you have to do when creating unit tests is actually adding a reference to the unit test project that points to the class project that you want to test. So to reference that, we're going to select our prime service unit test object, and we're going to add a project reference from the shortcut menu, and our project within is called numbers. So now those two are nicely interconnected with each other. Next step is creating a class where we actually define the unit tests. So within, we're going to create a new file. File type is a class. We provide a name, which could be prime service tests or something similar. And then accepting, I would say, the default naming template convention here. So we do have a namespace for the prime service unit tests and within an empty public class. Now we could make some minor changes here. So one of them is, instead of accepting the prime service, we're going to add the system to make sure that we could actually use the full namespace of our project. Next to that, if you want, you could also validate the actual project file of our project. So if we go up here in now the File Explorer, I'll make it a little bit bigger. So again, if you're not all that familiar with VS Code, we have the file context, as I call it, where you could actually work directly with the files itself. And in a lot of the previous modules and demos was mainly the part that we relied on. Where now we're using Solution Explorer. If you are, I would say, migrating or trying to migrate away from like Visual Studio into VS Code, I would say the default behavior is slightly the opposite, where Visual Studio would always give you Solution Explorer, and you would actually need to switch the viewing into the Explorer view to actually get the file level view. So just a little bit different in behavior, I would say, but not all that different. So out of that project file, so just a few highlights here. We have our .NET framework. We created a new project from scratch, so it's a bit different than the previous sample apps with .NET 6 or .NET 8. I thought it was just cool to bring in our latest framework. And then we also have our item group for the NuGet.NET packages, where you can see we're using XUnit. Why? Because obviously that's the unit testing framework that we selected at the start of the project. And then a little bit further, we also have our XUnit once more as the framework item. So just to validate what we already did before in other examples is just validating. I would be surprised if my code would not work as expected, but I could do .NET build to validate, like, well, we start with a fresh new project, and I think it's always a good practice to validate that everything is working as expected. So this is the baseline, where now obviously we're gonna heavily shift to integrating GitHub Copilot chat as part of our unit testing project. So I'm gonna close my terminal for now. I'm gonna open up my Copilot little friend here on the side, and we're gonna write some unit testing. So the way to do that, and again, you already know there's a couple of different ways to do that. So I would say the starting point is our prime services little starting point of the application, where we have a method here to validate if our results, the numbers that we're playing with, are actually prime numbers or not. So I select that method, and I could just go to the keyword, or I could actually make a selection. And once more, if you followed along in the sequence of the course, you already know that there's a lot of different options: the full project, a specific file, or even a selection within the file. So again, a lot of different options there. So from here, I made my selection and I opened my chat view. And we can now add the attach context. It's like the little paperclip, like uploading a file, attaching a file. That's what we're doing here. Now it's going to allow us to actually search for files, and it's also showing the recently opened files, where in this case, I'm going to pick my Prime Service test files. Because what we're doing now is telling Copilot here on the side, like, these are the files that I want you to work with. Another option to make this a little bit faster is actually drag and drop. So you could grab a file like the Prime Service unit test, like let's grab the whole project. Gonna try and make it a little bit bigger here so you can see what we're actually doing. Gonna move this out a little bit. There we go. So I'm gonna add my unit test project file into our attached context, and maybe I should also move my actual unit test in there, but that's already selected. Cool. So what it's going to do here is now obviously updating context. Now what we're doing here is telling GitHub Copilot, like, for my unit tests, these are the files that I want you to use as a source. So what it's going to do in the background using that generative AI is analyzing the code that you already have and starting to integrate the changes. So from here, we're going to add the pre-built context. So as you can see here, it's already providing its own chat completion suggestions, where now one of them is /tests add unit tests. You could obviously type this in manually yourself in that chat completion window, but why would you type that all in if you can just pick it from that suggestion list? So from here, it's going to take about a minute, and GitHub Copilot is now coming back with a set of suggestions. So looking at the code a little bit, what it's doing is now adding an explanation here. So it's using those 3 references, the files that we included, creating a test where it's providing a new name. We didn't have to specify that. Writing some test methods where it's now testing for a few different scenarios, testing for numbers less than 2, testing for prime and non-prime numbers. Looks pretty complete to me, actually quite powerful that it came up with those options. And then obviously the key part for you as a developer is seeing the actual code, what is getting added into our project. We like the suggestions, so here on the side, we're gonna apply the edits. And again, what it's doing with apply edits, instead of like just traditional copy paste, is live injecting the suggestions into our application code file. I'm going to save the changes. So we're going to do file, let's do save, just to make sure. It's going to ask us like where to store this. I'm inside my project, looks all okay to me. So with all that code getting generated, we could now validate from the terminal, where you could do .NET build. Always a good test to validate again the code. I think I repeated this multiple times, but just trying to get myself still into that mindset that you shouldn't just accept all the suggestions from GitHub Copilot, but also validating if it actually all works as expected. So I did a quick .NET build here. And again, if you're a bit familiar with just running unit testing in the more traditional, maybe more manual way, after running .NET build, you can see that it actually allows us now to run some testing. Now, for now, I would say I'm not going to run the actual testing. It's more about focusing on how GitHub Copilot can help you in writing the actual tests. Now, the first part was all about using our GitHub Copilot chat on the site, but technically you can do the same using inline chat. So we're still in our Solution Explorer inside our Prime Services, and we're gonna open our prime service class. I'm going to close this from here. There we go. Where now I could just be in this file, so we don't really have to select anything, but you could also select like the publish class prime service. Selecting the method is prime, using Control-I to trigger that inline chat, and now asking from here, create unit tests for the isPrime method, although it's selected, so I don't think we really need to specify that. And then using the XUnit framework. Giving it a go, and then again, waiting for the chat completion. And what it's going to do here is now showing me once more the rewrite of the code suggestions, quite important, integrating all the syntax in our code, what XUnit is actually expecting. So that's another little powerful feature, I would say. Once more, comparing the chat capabilities directly from within the chat window or using the inline chat straight away, accepting the changes, running .NET Build, and all that is just back to our traditional experience as developers. So this completes our first part of this demo. So for this next demo, we're still in our unit testing framework scenario, right? Where you as a developer, you need to create some unit testing. We're still using the XUnit framework, knowing that you do have some other options. In the previous demo, we mainly integrated our GitHub Copilot chat experience, where now I'm going to show you yet another approach to basically get the same idea. So the starting point is almost the same. I'm inside my file explorer. I created a blank new project doing the same steps as before, but now I'm inside a totally new namespace called system numbers unit test, just the name of our project, right? And we have an empty public class. So this is like a fresh template, nothing happened, no code is in there, where it could literally be as easy as going into your class, adding a new line. And as you can see here, in just a split second, it's providing me all the information that I need. Now, how does this work? Again, remember, first of all, we're using generative AI, which means we're using the information from the large language model where our GitHub Copilot has been trained on. It's using information from the public internet. It's using information from public GitHub repos. There are some other ways that we talked about in the Getting Started module of this course, where you could actually integrate out of the GitHub Enterprise Edition, you could integrate settings to define like, hey, GitHub Copilot, I want you to also use our corporate GitHub repos. So all based on that, it's now recognizing that I tried to create a class here called Prime Service Tests. And just out of using that one single keyword, it's actually pulling up a pretty complete set of unit tests that allows me to now go in and run my testing. Now, our demo is not complete yet, although again, I actually think it's pretty powerful, really mind-blowing how more intelligent it actually becomes over time. But what we can do now is actually combining the two Copilot scenarios. What I mean by that is the first part here was using GitHub Copilot, the code completion, where now I could continue working with my project and still benefiting from the chat conversations. Little bit of repeat from previous demos in other modules. If you've been watching through all of them, you're going to go like, well, this is quite exact what we already did before. But we could make it a little bit more complex, because remember, the second part of the module was not just running unit tests, but also focusing on the edge cases and some of the more special, maybe more complex scenarios if you want. I'm going to try and show you that although it could look like a complex scenario from a unit testing perspective, that thanks to our chat completion, it's actually becoming pretty straightforward. So we're going to do our little prompt engineering again, add workspace, using selection, which means please use the Prime Services test file that we already have open. And I could ask for, are there any edge cases that we should test? So an easy basic prompt where this always reminds me at being in this meeting room with some of your colleague developers, where you would literally ask that question like, hey, I'm watching your code and shouldn't we think about some edge cases? It's just so natural. It's literally what I remember being in such meetings with my peer developers. And now you could almost see that GitHub Copilot is becoming that next peer developer, as we already like to call it multiple times. So what it's going to do here is looking at the workspace using 69 references. You could go like, wait a minute, we don't have 69 files in our source application. So how does this work? Well, it's not looking at the files. It's actually looking at the snippets of code. So one reference is our solution file line 1 to 31, looking at some other snippets within our application and highlighting all the files, recognizing the NuGet packages we're using, trying to find a distinction between the X unit, between like NUnit or MS test. And it's just using all that information to provide you a pretty accurate answer. Out of that, it's literally capturing our edge cases, what you see over here. So it's going to validate large prime numbers. I think it's a pretty good edge case to test against. Large non-prime numbers, the same, but doing it opposite. And then obviously validating the prime numbers and non-prime numbers. There could be other scenarios. Again, if you're following along, on your end, it might look a little bit different, but the concept would be exactly the same. So from here, we could actually start accepting the suggestions. You already know how to do that. And we could also move it straight into our code using the insert at cursor. I'll remind some of you if you missed that little piece here. So you got a few options: insert at cursor, insert straight into the code file that already opened, or just traditional copy paste, where you might go like, well, I'm going to play safe. I'm not going to grab the full suggestion of the code snippet, but I'm going to copy paste only certain parts of it. So again, pretty straightforward. I would save the file. I would run the .NET build, validating code, testing code. And then from there, like exact same scenario we had in the previous demo, it will show you the little green testing arrows. You click on them, you run a test. You could run a single test, you could run all of them. That's the main idea. Pretty cool. I'm actually happy that we managed to get through this module, and obviously also that my demos were working, because again, unit testing are always a little bit, I would say, a few steps ahead of what Peter feels like comfortable in writing code. So super excited about that. Now at the other side, we're at the end of this module, but it doesn't mean that learning has to stop for you. What this means, using the few links here coming up on screen, we're sharing links to the official GitHub documentation or the GitHub Copilot specific documentation. That's the first link, docs.github.com/Copilot, obviously allowing you to read through a lot more details about what GitHub Copilot can do for you. Second link is how to integrate GitHub Copilot into Visual Studio Code and Visual Studio. We already talked about a lot of capabilities, features in this specific module. And remember, this is one module in a larger collection, all pointing to that AZ-2007 course. And then the last link we offer is really starting to see the capabilities, understanding the full collection of features, how to embrace GitHub Copilot as becoming your next AI peer programmer. So with that, we're done with this module. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being here, but also allow me to invite you to join me into one of the other modules in this GitHub Copilot course. Thank you for now, and see you back pretty soon.